The desert wind howled across the barren landscape of Afghanistan as Captain Kim Campbell checked her instruments one more time. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the jagged mountains in the distance, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She had been flying the A-10 Thunderbolt II for 3 years now, and every mission still gave her that same mixture of excitement and focused determination. Kim wasn't supposed to be here. Growing up in a small town in California, she had spent her childhood watching planes cut across the blue sky, dreaming of the day she would be up there too. Her father had been a mechanic and he would take her to air shows whenever they came to town. She remembered pressing her face against the fence, watching the jets perform impossible maneuvers, feeling the roar of the engines in her chest like a second heartbeat. But dreams and reality are different things. When she told her high school counselor she wanted to be a fighter pilot, the woman had smiled politely and suggested she consider nursing or teaching instead. That was in the late 1980s, when the doors were only just beginning to crack open for women in combat aviation. Kim had smiled back and thanked her, but that night she went home and filled out her application to the Air Force Academy anyway. The journey had been brutal. She remembered her first day at the academy, standing in a line with dozens of other terrified freshmen while upperclassmen shouted in their faces. She remembered the grueling physical training, the endless studying, the moments when she wanted to quit but pushed through anyway. Some of her male classmates had made it clear they didn't think she belonged there. They never said it directly, but she could see it in their eyes, hear it in the way they spoke to her. Kim had learned to ignore the doubt. She focused on being better, working harder, proving that she deserved to be there not because she was a woman but because she was good, really good. By the time she graduated, she was near the top of her class, and she had earned the respect of most of her fellow cadets. The ones who still doubted her didn't matter anymore. Now, years later, she was here in Afghanistan, flying one of the most dangerous close air support missions the military had to offer. The A-10 Warthog, as it was affectionately called, wasn't sleek or fast like the fighter jets she had admired as a child. It was ugly, slow, and built like a tank, but it was also the best aircraft in the world for one specific job: protecting troops on the ground. The radio crackled to life, pulling Kim from her thoughts. It was her wingman, Captain John Reynolds, flying in formation beside her. They had been partners for 8 months now, and they worked together like a well-oiled machine. John was from Texas with an easy smile and a calm demeanor that never seemed to crack, even in the most intense situations. "Looking good on fuel," John said through the radio. "Should be a quiet patrol today." Kim glanced at her fuel gauge and nodded even though he couldn't see her. "Let's hope so. I could use a boring afternoon." But even as she said it, something felt off. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now those instincts were telling her that today was not going to be boring at all. The intelligence briefing that morning had been tense. There were reports of increased Taliban activity in the region, and several SEAL teams were operating deep in enemy territory, conducting raids on suspected insurgent strongholds. The SEALs were the best of the best, highly trained special operations forces who could handle almost anything. But even they needed air support sometimes. That's what Kim and John were here for. They were the guardian angels, circling high above, ready to rain down fire if the men on the ground needed them. Kim scanned the landscape below. The terrain was unforgiving, a maze of rocky valleys and steep mountains that provided countless hiding places for the enemy. Small villages dotted the valleys, clusters of mud brick buildings that looked like they hadn't changed in centuries. Somewhere down there, American forces were moving through the shadows, hunting dangerous men who wanted them dead. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't John's voice. It was urgent, clipped, professional. "Hog 21, this is Viper 6. We have troops in contact. Repeat, troops in contact. Multiple casualties. We need immediate air support, over." Kim's heart rate jumped, but her hands remained steady on the controls. This was what she had trained for. "Viper 6, this is Hog 21. Copy, troops in contact. Send coordinates and situation report." As the ground controller rattled off the information, Kim's mind was already processing the tactical situation. A SEAL team had been ambushed while conducting a raid on a Taliban compound. They were pinned down by heavy machine gun fire from multiple positions. Worse, the enemy had reinforcements coming from a nearby village. The SEALs were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. "How many friendlies?" Kim asked. her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. There was a brief pause, then the controller's voice came back. We have approximately 381 American personnel in the immediate area. Multiple SEAL teams and support elements. They're spread across 3 separate compounds and they're all taking fire. 381 lives. The number hit Kim like a physical blow. This wasn't just a small team in trouble. This was a major operation that had gone sideways and hundreds of America's finest warriors were in danger. We're inbound, Kim said, banking her A-10 hard toward the coordinates. ETA 4 minutes, John's voice came through the radio. I'm with you, Kim. Let's go get our boys. As they raced toward the battle, Kim ran through the weapons checklist in her mind. The A-10 was a flying arsenal, carrying everything from precision-guided bombs to rockets to the massive GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon that could tear through tanks like paper. But the most important weapon she had was her training and her experience. She had done this before, flown into hot zones and brought thunder from above, but never with this many lives at stake. The desert landscape blurred beneath her as she pushed the throttle forward. 4 minutes felt like an eternity when men were dying on the ground. She thought about those SEALs crouched behind whatever cover they could find, bullets whipping past their heads, wondering if help would arrive in time. She would make it in time. She had to, because that's what she did. That's what the Warthog did. They protected the troops on the ground no matter what. The battle was waiting and Captain Kim Campbell was on her way. The mountains rushed up to meet them as Kim and John dove toward the battle. Kim could see smoke rising from multiple points in the valley below, dark columns against the fading daylight. Tracer rounds arced through the air like deadly fireworks, creating a spiderweb of red and green lines that marked where the fighting was most intense. Viper 6, Hog 21 is overhead. Talk me onto the targets, Kim said, her eyes scanning the chaos below. From 5,000 feet, it looked like an ant farm that had been kicked over, with small figures running between buildings and taking cover behind walls and vehicles. The ground controller's voice was strained, and Kim could hear the rattle of gunfire in the background. Hog 21, we've got enemy positions in buildings on the north side of the compound. They're dug in with PKM machine guns and RPGs. We can't advance and we can't retreat. They've got us boxed in. Kim spotted the compound immediately. It was a collection of flat-roofed buildings surrounded by a low wall. She could see muzzle flashes coming from at least 5 different positions, all concentrating their fire on a larger building in the center where the SEALs had taken cover. I've got eyes on, Kim said, marking targets now. She activated her targeting system, designating each enemy position with the precision that had made her one of the top pilots in her squadron. But there was a problem. The enemy fighters had positioned themselves well, using the civilian population as cover. Kim could see women and children running through the streets trying to escape the violence. This was the nightmare scenario that every close air support pilot dreaded. The enemy knew that American forces would do everything possible to avoid civilian casualties, and they used that knowledge as a shield. Kim's jaw tightened. She would have to be perfect. One mistake, one bomb dropped 10 feet in the wrong direction, and innocent people would die. Viper 6, confirm no civilians in the target buildings, Kim said. Negative. The controller responded quickly. The northern buildings are confirmed enemy positions. Civilians have evacuated. You are cleared hot. Kim took a deep breath. This was it. She rolled her A-10 into a dive, feeling the G-forces push her back into her seat. The ground rushed up at her, the buildings growing larger in her canopy. Her finger hovered over the trigger for the GAU-8 cannon. The sound of the cannon was unlike anything else in military aviation. A deep, grinding roar that sounded like the sky was being torn apart. Kim squeezed the trigger and felt the entire aircraft shudder as the massive gun fired 70 rounds per second. Each round was the size of a milk bottle, and they hit the target building with devastating force. The building's roof disintegrated, sending chunks of concrete and dust exploding into the air. Kim held the trigger down for 3 seconds, painting a line of destruction across the enemy position. Then she pulled up hard, banking away as she climbed back to altitude. Good hits, the ground controller shouted. That machine gun nest is destroyed. We're moving now, but there was no time to celebrate. John's voice came through the radio, urgent. Kim, we've got more targets. Enemy reinforcements are arriving from the east. Looks like at least 50 fighters in technical vehicles. Technical vehicles were pickup trucks that had been modified with heavy weapons mounted in the truck bed. They were fast, mobile, and deadly. Kim spotted them immediately. A convoy of trucks racing down the dirt road toward the compound, kicking up huge clouds of dust. "I see them," Kim said, taking the lead vehicle. She lined up her shot and fired a Maverick missile, watching as the rocket streaked away from her wing and slammed into the first truck. The explosion was massive, a ball of orange flame that consumed the vehicle and sent debris flying in all directions. The convoy scattered, trucks swerving off the road to avoid the same fate. But they kept coming. The Taliban fighters were determined, and they were willing to die to overrun the American position. Kim could see them jumping out of their vehicles, using the rocks and buildings as cover as they advanced on foot. "We need to slow them down," John said. He rolled into his own attack run, his cannon tearing into another group of enemy fighters who had taken position behind a stone wall. Kim was already lining up her next target when the radio exploded with urgent voices. All aircraft, this is Viper 7. We have a downed helicopter. Black Hawk down in grid 2473. Survivors on the ground taking heavy fire. Need immediate extraction support." Kim's blood ran cold. A downed helicopter meant the situation had just gone from bad to catastrophic. Those helicopter crews were sitting ducks, and the Taliban would be rushing to capture or kill them. She glanced at her fuel gauge. They had maybe 20 minutes before they would have to return to base to refuel. "Viper 7, this is Hog 21. What's the situation with the survivors?" "We have 4 crew members, all alive but injured. They're taking fire from the tree line to their west. We need someone to keep the enemy off them until we can get a rescue bird in there." Kim didn't hesitate. "We're on our way." She banked hard toward the new coordinates, leaving the compound battle behind. John stayed with her, the 2 A-10s flying in tight formation. They had to split their attention now between 2 separate fights, and Kim knew that spreading themselves thin was dangerous. But there was no choice. Those helicopter crews needed them. As they approached the crash site, Kim could see the Black Hawk lying on its side in an open field, rotors twisted and broken. Smoke poured from the engine, small figures huddled behind the wreckage, and she could see the muzzle flashes from the tree line as enemy fighters tried to move in for the kill. "Viper 7, Hog 21 is overhead. We're going to put down suppressive fire on that tree line. Keep your heads down." Kim rolled into another attack dive, this time using her rockets. She fired a salvo of high-explosive rockets that slammed into the trees, creating a wall of fire and shrapnel that tore through the enemy positions. She pulled up and circled around for another pass, John right behind her. They worked in a deadly rhythm, taking turns diving and firing, keeping constant pressure on the enemy. The Taliban fighters tried to scatter, but there was nowhere to hide from the A-10s. Every time they tried to move toward the downed helicopter, Kim or John was there raining down fire from above. "Rescue bird is inbound," the controller said. "ETA 5 minutes. Keep them safe, 5 minutes." Kim checked her ammunition. She was running low on rockets, but she still had plenty of cannon rounds. She would make every shot count. Those 4 helicopter crew members were going home. She would make sure of it. Below her, the battle raged on. 381 American lives depending on 2 A-10 pilots to keep them alive. Kim had never felt more focused in her entire life. The rescue helicopter appeared on the horizon, a Black Hawk flying low and fast toward the crash site. Kim could see it approaching, but she also saw something else that made her stomach drop. More enemy fighters were emerging from a village to the north, at least 30 of them, running toward the downed helicopter with weapons raised. "John, you see those fighters from the north?" Kim said into the radio. "I see them. I'm on it." John peeled away and dove toward the new threat while Kim continued to cover the western tree line. Her cannon roared again, sending another burst of rounds into the enemy positions. She was keeping them pinned down, but barely. The Taliban fighters were brave and determined, and they kept trying to advance despite the devastating fire from above. The rescue helicopter touched down next to the crashed Black Hawk, and Kim could see the crew members running toward it, 2 of them being carried by the others. They were moving slowly, too slowly. The enemy fighters were closing in. "They're not going to make it," Kim said, more to herself than anyone else. She pushed the throttle forward, diving even lower than before. She was at 3,000 feet now, well within range of any anti-aircraft weapons the enemy might have. But she didn't care. Those men needed her. She fired her cannon again, this time so close to the rescue helicopter that she could see the crew chief looking up at her aircraft as the rounds impacted just 50 yards away from them. The enemy fighters scattered, diving for cover as the massive rounds tore up the ground around them. "Go, go, go!" Kim shouted, even though the rescue crew couldn't hear her. She watched as the last injured crew member was pulled into the helicopter. The Black Hawk lifted off, tilting forward as it gained speed and raced away from the crash site. "Rescue bird is clear," the controller said, and Kim could hear the relief in his voice. "Hog 21, you just saved 4 lives. Thank you." But there was no time for gratitude. Kim checked her fuel gauge again and felt her chest tighten. They were running dangerously low. She had maybe 10 minutes of combat time left before they would be forced to leave. "John, fuel check," she said. "I'm at bingo fuel," John replied. Bingo fuel meant he was at the minimum level needed to safely return to base. "I can give you 5 more minutes, then I have to head back." Kim did the math in her head. If John left, she would be alone over the battlefield. One A-10 against an enemy force that seemed to be growing by the minute. But the SEALs on the ground were still fighting. She could hear the desperation in the ground controller's voice every time he called for another gun run. "Go ahead and head back," Kim said. "I'll stay as long as I can." "Kim, that's not the plan. We're supposed to stay together." The plan changed when that helicopter went down. "These guys need air support or they're going to get overrun." "I'll be fine. Go get fuel and come back." There was a long pause, then John's voice came back, quieter. "Be careful. I'll be back in 40 minutes. Kim watched as John's A-10 turned and headed toward the horizon. Now she was truly alone. 1 pilot and 1 aircraft against an entire Taliban force. She took a deep breath and turned back toward the main compound where the SEALs were still trapped. The situation had deteriorated while she was dealing with the helicopter rescue. The enemy had brought in mortars and she could see explosions going off inside the compound where the American forces were positioned. The SEALs were trapped in a shrinking perimeter, and the enemy was closing in from 3 sides. "Viper 6, Hog 21. What do you need?" Kim asked. "We need everything you've got," the controller said. His voice was hoarse now and Kim could hear the exhaustion in it. "They're coming at us from the west and south. If they break through our line, we're done." Kim scanned the battlefield, her experienced eyes picking out the enemy positions. They were using a classic hammer and anvil tactic, pushing from 2 sides to crush the Americans in between. She needed to break one of those advancing forces to give the SEALs room to maneuver. She chose the western advance, where the enemy was closest to breaking through. There were at least 40 fighters moving through a series of connected buildings, using the walls and doorways as cover as they worked their way toward the American position. Kim lined up her attack run, but as she began her dive, she heard a sound that every pilot dreads. A warning tone in her headset, sharp and insistent. Missile lock. Someone down there had a surface-to-air missile and they had just painted her aircraft. She reacted instantly, releasing flares and chaff while pulling into a hard turn. The flares were designed to fool heat-seeking missiles, burning white-hot as they fell away from the aircraft. She felt the G-forces crushing her down into her seat as she maneuvered, her body heavy and her vision starting to narrow. The missile streaked past her canopy, missing by less than 50 feet. Kim's heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. She completed her turn and came back around for the attack run. Whoever had fired that missile would be trying to reload right now. She had a small window before they could shoot again. Her cannon blazed once more, walking the line of destruction through the buildings where the enemy fighters were positioned. She saw secondary explosions as her rounds hit ammunition stockpiles, orange fireballs that lit up the growing darkness. The enemy advance faltered, fighters running in all directions to escape the fire from above. "Good hits," the ground controller shouted. "That bought us some time. We're repositioning now." Kim pulled up and gained altitude, checking her systems. The missile had been close, too close. Her hands were shaking slightly now as the adrenaline began to catch up with her. She forced herself to breathe slowly to stay calm and focused. She checked her fuel gauge again and felt her stomach sink. She was past bingo fuel now. She should have left 5 minutes ago. If she stayed much longer, she might not have enough fuel to make it back to base. She would have to eject over enemy territory, becoming just another person on the ground who needed rescuing. But when she looked down at the battlefield, she could see the SEALs still fighting. They were holding their ground, but barely. If she left now, the enemy would sense the weakness and press their advantage. More Americans would die. Kim made her decision. She would stay. She would use every last round of ammunition and every last drop of fuel to protect those men on the ground. If she had to eject, then she would eject. But she would not abandon her mission. She would not abandon those SEALs. Viper 6, Hog 21. I'm staying on station. Send me targets. There was a pause, then the controller's voice came back thick with emotion. Roger that, Hog 21. You're a guardian angel. We've got targets for you. Kim rolled her A-10 into another attack dive. The ugly, slow, beautiful aircraft responding to her commands like an extension of her own body. The sky was darkening now, the sun almost completely gone behind the mountains. The battle was turning into a nightmare of shadows and muzzle flashes, but Kim could see clearly. She always could when it mattered most, and right now, with 381 American lives depending on her, she could see exactly what needed to be done. The darkness was complete now, with only the stars and a thin slice of moon providing any natural light. Kim had switched to her night vision systems, and the world below had transformed into a green-tinted landscape of heat signatures and infrared markers. The battlefield looked like something from another planet, glowing bodies moving through the darkness like ghosts. She had been over the battlefield for nearly 40 minutes now, and every muscle in her body ached from the constant maneuvering and the stress of combat. Her mouth was dry, and she realized she hadn't taken a drink of water since before the fighting started. But she couldn't think about that now. There were still targets to hit. Hog 21, we've got enemy mortar positions on the ridgeline to the southeast, the ground controller said. Can you take them out? They're tearing us apart. Kim spotted the mortar positions immediately, 3 teams of fighters using the high ground to rain shells down on the compound. She calculated the attack angle in her head. The ridgeline was tricky terrain, with steep slopes and rocky outcroppings that would make a low-level gun run dangerous. She didn't hesitate. She rolled into the attack dive, pushing her aircraft toward the limits of what it was designed to do. The altimeter spun downward as she dove, the ground rushing up to meet her. She could see the mortar teams now, small figures silhouetted against their own muzzle flashes as they loaded and fired. At 2,000 feet, Kim squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared, and she watched as her rounds tore into the first mortar position. Bodies and equipment flew through the air, and the gun fell silent. She walked her fire across to the second position, then the third, destroying all 3 in a single pass. But as she pulled up, she heard another warning tone. Missile lock again. This time there was no time to react. She punched out more flares and pulled into the hardest turn she had ever made, the G-forces crushing her. Her vision tunneling until all she could see was a pinpoint of light straight ahead. The missile hit her aircraft. The explosion was deafening. Kim felt the entire plane shudder, and warning lights lit up across her instrument panel like a Christmas tree. The aircraft lurched to the left, and she fought the controls to keep it level. Alarms were screaming in her headset, and she could smell smoke in the cockpit. Mayday, mayday, Kim said into the radio, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. Hog 21 is hit. I repeat, Hog 21 is hit, assessing damage. She ran through her systems check, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The missile had struck her left engine and continued into the hydraulic systems. The entire left side of her aircraft was destroyed. She had lost all hydraulic pressure, which meant she had no way to move the control surfaces that allowed her to steer the plane. The flight stick in her hand was useless, disconnected from the aircraft systems. By all rights, she should be ejecting right now. Protocol was clear. Loss of hydraulic systems meant loss of control, and loss of control meant immediate ejection. But ejecting meant landing in enemy territory, and she had just seen how many Taliban fighters were down there waiting. She would be captured or killed within minutes. More importantly, ejecting meant abandoning those SEALs. They were still fighting down there, still depending on her for air support. If she left now, they might not survive the night. Kim made a decision that would later be called either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless, depending on who was telling the story. She decided to stay in the aircraft and try to fly it home. But first, she had one more mission to complete. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was famous for being tough. It was designed to take damage and keep flying, with redundant systems and armored protection around the cockpit. But no aircraft was designed to fly without hydraulics. Kim knew she was attempting something that most pilots would say was impossible. She experimented with the controls, trying to figure out how to maneuver the crippled aircraft. She discovered that if she used the throttles carefully, adjusting the power between her remaining right engine and the damaged left engine, she could create differential thrust that would turn the plane. It was crude and imprecise, but it worked. Barely. Hog 21, say status, the ground controller said, his voice tight with concern. Do you need to divert? Kim looked down at the battlefield one more time. She could see the SEALs still pinned down, still fighting. She had ammunition left in her cannon. Not much, but enough for one more pass. Maybe two if she was careful. Negative, Kim said. I'm still in the fight. Send me targets. There was stunned silence on the radio. Then are you sure? Your aircraft is hit. You should get out of here. I've got one more gun run in me, Kim said. Maybe two. Let's make them count. What do you need? She could almost hear the ground controller shaking his head in disbelief. But when he spoke again, his voice was firm. There's a building on the south side of the compound. Enemy fighters are using it to coordinate their attack. If you can take it out, it might break their assault. Kim spotted the building. It was larger than the others, with a flat roof and thick walls. Probably the village elder's house or some kind of community center. Now it was an enemy command post and it needed to be destroyed. Flying the damaged aircraft was like trying to drive a car with no steering wheel. Kim used tiny adjustments of the throttles to line up her shot, the plane wobbling and lurching through the sky. She could feel every damaged system screaming at her, the entire aircraft threatening to come apart at any moment. She pushed into a shallow dive, not daring to use the steep attack angles she had been using before. She didn't trust the aircraft to pull out of a steep dive with no hydraulics. This would have to be a low and slow pass, which meant she would be exposed to ground fire for longer than she wanted to think about. The building grew larger in her sights. She could see muzzle flashes coming from the windows and the roof. They knew she was coming. They were ready for her. She squeezed the trigger and held it down, unleashing the last of her cannon ammunition in one long burst. The rounds tore through the building like it was made of cardboard. The roof collapsed, the walls crumbled, and secondary explosions from stored weapons and ammunition turned the structure into an inferno. Kim pulled up, or tried to, but the aircraft was barely responding. She was flying at 300 feet now, dangerously low, every rock and tree a potential threat. Target destroyed, the ground controller shouted. Hog 21, you did it! The enemy is breaking off the attack. They're retreating. Kim allowed herself a small smile. They had won. The SEALs were safe. All 381 of them would see another sunrise because she had stayed in the fight. But now came the hard part. She had to get this broken aircraft home, across miles of hostile territory with no way to control it properly and fuel running critically low. She pointed the nose toward home and said a silent prayer. The real test was just beginning. The flight back to base was the longest 30 minutes of Kim Campbell's life. Every second felt like an hour as she wrestled with the damaged aircraft, using nothing but throttle adjustments and her own skill to keep the Warthog in the air. The plane wanted to roll left because of the destroyed engine, and she had to constantly fight to keep the wings level. Sweat poured down her face despite the cool air at altitude. Her arms burned from the constant strain of manipulating the controls. Every few seconds, a new warning light would illuminate on her instrument panel, each one announcing another system that had failed or was failing. She ignored them all. The only things that mattered were airspeed and altitude. As long as she maintained both, she had a chance. The radio crackled to life. It was John Reynolds, her wingman, who had returned to base to refuel. Kim, I just heard what happened. I'm taking off now to come get you. Give me your position. Negative, John, Kim said, her voice steady despite everything. I'm heading home. No need to waste fuel. I've got this. Kim, you have no hydraulics. You should eject while you're still over relatively open ground. We can get a rescue bird to you. Kim looked down at the dark landscape below. Mountains and valleys, all of it hostile territory. If she ejected, she would be alone on the ground in the middle of Taliban country. The rescue helicopter would have to fight its way in to get her, putting more lives at risk. No, she had made her decision. She was bringing this aircraft home. I'm staying with the plane, Kim said firmly. Tell the base I'm coming in. They should have emergency crews ready. There was a long pause, then John's voice came back, quieter now. You're the bravest person I know, Kim. I'll see you on the ground. Kim focused on flying. The base was still 20 miles away, which didn't sound like much until you were flying a crippled aircraft that could fall out of the sky at any moment. She had to navigate through a mountain pass, and normally that would be easy. But without hydraulics, even small course corrections were difficult and dangerous. She approached the pass at 5,000 feet, watching the peaks rise up on either side of her. The passage between them was maybe 3 miles wide, which would normally be more than enough room. But Kim's aircraft was barely responding to her commands. She was essentially flying a glider with an engine, hoping that momentum and careful throttle work would be enough to keep her in the air. The turbulence hit her as she entered the pass. Mountain winds, always unpredictable, caught her aircraft and threw it sideways. Kim felt the plane lurch to the left, the damaged side dipping toward the rocks below. She pushed the right throttle forward, adding more power to that engine, trying to level the wings. For a terrifying moment, the aircraft continued to roll left, accelerating toward an uncontrolled spin. Kim's hand moved to the ejection handle, ready to punch out if the plane became unrecoverable. But at the last second, the increased power from the right engine caught, and the aircraft slowly, painfully, rolled back to level flight. Kim exhaled a breath she didn't know she had been holding. That had been too close. She was running out of luck, and she still had 15 miles to go. The terrain began to flatten out as she left the mountains behind. Ahead, she could see the lights of the airbase, a small cluster of illumination in the vast darkness. It looked beautiful, like a beacon guiding her home. But she still had to land this aircraft, and that would be the most dangerous part of the entire flight. Landing an A-10 with full hydraulics was straightforward. Landing one with no hydraulics was something that had never been done before. The flight manual said it was impossible. The engineers who designed the aircraft said it couldn't be done. But Kim Campbell was about to prove them all wrong. Tower Hog 21 is 10 miles out. Requesting priority landing. I have no hydraulics and will be making a manual reversion landing. The tower controller's voice came back immediately. Hog 21, you are cleared for landing on any runway. Emergency crews are standing by. Be advised, we have never had a successful manual reversion landing in an A-10. Do you wish to eject? Negative, Kim said. I'm bringing her home. She began her approach to the runway using the throttles to guide the aircraft into position. The base was rushing up at her now, the runway lights forming a bright line across the desert floor. She needed to maintain exactly the right speed. Too fast and she would overshoot the runway. Too slow and she would stall and crash before reaching it. Kim lined up the aircraft as best she could, but without normal control surfaces, everything was approximate. She was coming in at an angle that was slightly off-center, and there was nothing she could do to correct it. She would have to ride it out and hope the landing gear could handle the stress. At 1,000 feet, she lowered the landing gear manually, using the emergency extension system. She felt the gear lock into place and said another silent prayer that the mechanism had worked properly. If the gear collapsed on landing, the aircraft would cartwheel down the runway and probably explode. At 500 feet, she reduced power to both engines, trying to establish a descent rate that wouldn't drive the aircraft into the ground too hard. The A-10 was designed to take a beating, but even it had limits. She needed to kiss the runway, not crash into it. The ground rushed up at her. Kim could see fire trucks and ambulances lined up along the runway, their lights flashing in the darkness. She could see people standing outside the tower watching her approach. Everyone on the base had turned out to see if she would make it. At 100 feet, Kim pulled back on the throttles, reducing power even more. The aircraft dropped, faster than she wanted, but she had no way to arrest the descent. The runway was right there, just seconds away. She could see the white-painted numbers marking the landing threshold. The main landing gear touched down first with a jolt that rattled her teeth. Kim immediately cut power to both engines and pulled the nose up slightly, trying to keep the nose gear off the ground for as long as possible to scrub off speed. The aircraft bounced once, twice, the damaged systems screaming in protest. Then the nose gear touched down, and Kim was rolling down the runway in a crippled aircraft with no way to steer. She was going 70 knots, then 60, then 50. The aircraft was drifting toward the left side of the runway, heading for the grass and dirt beyond. Kim played with the throttles one more time, giving a tiny burst of power to the right engine. It wasn't much, just enough to nudge the aircraft back toward the center line. At 40 knots, she knew she was going to make it. At 30 knots, the aircraft finally rolled to a stop, sitting in the middle of the runway with smoke still pouring from the damaged left side. Kim sat in the cockpit for a long moment, her hands shaking, her breath coming in gasps. She had done it. She had flown a hydraulically dead aircraft for 30 minutes over hostile territory and landed it safely. The engineers would say it was impossible, but she had just proved them wrong. The emergency crews surrounded the aircraft immediately. Firefighters spraying foam on the damaged engine, while medics climbed up to the cockpit to check on her. Kim unstrapped herself and stood up on wobbly legs. One of the medics offered her a hand and she took it gratefully. climbing down from the cockpit to solid ground. The moment her feet touched the tarmac, her legs gave out. The medics caught her, easing her down to sit on the ground. Kim looked up at her aircraft, at the massive hole in the left side, at the destroyed engine and the shredded metal where the missile had hit. She shouldn't have survived that. The aircraft shouldn't have stayed in the air, but it had. And she had. Because that's what Warthog pilots did. They took the hits and kept flying. They protected the troops on the ground no matter what. They brought their aircraft home even when everyone said it was impossible. John Reynolds came running across the tarmac, still in his flight suit, having just landed his own aircraft. He dropped to his knees beside Kim and pulled her into a hug. "You crazy, magnificent pilot," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You actually did it. You brought her home." Kim smiled weakly. "Had to. Can't let you have all the glory." Around them, people were gathering. Pilots, crew chiefs, maintenance personnel, base commanders. They stood in silence, looking at the damaged aircraft and the pilot who had refused to give up. Someone started clapping, and then everyone joined in, the sound echoing across the airfield. Kim looked at all those faces, and she thought about the faces she couldn't see. The 381 SEALs and support personnel who were still alive because she had stayed in the fight. They would never know her name. Most of them would never know that a single A-10 pilot had stood between them and disaster. But Kim knew. And that was enough. She had done her job. She had protected the troops on the ground. She had been their guardian angel when they needed one most. The rest was just details. The medical tent was busy with activity when they brought Kim in. Doctors and nurses moved around her, checking her vital signs and looking for injuries. She kept telling them she was fine, but they insisted on a full examination. Her body was running on pure adrenaline, and she knew that once it wore off, she would feel every ache and pain from the hours of intense flying. Commander Sarah Mitchell pushed through the crowd of medical personnel. She was the wing commander, a veteran pilot herself who had flown combat missions in the First Gulf War. Her face was stern, but Kim could see the relief in her eyes. "Captain Campbell," Mitchell said formally, "that was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish." "I haven't decided which yet." Kim managed a weak smile. "I was just doing my job, ma'am." "Your job was to provide close air support, not to attempt a landing that every manual says is impossible," Mitchell said. But then her expression softened. "But you saved 381 lives tonight. The SEAL commander has already called to thank us personally. He said his teams would have been overrun without you." The words hit Kim harder than she expected. She had known the situation was desperate, but hearing it confirmed made it real. Those SEALs had families, children, people who loved them and were waiting for them to come home. And tonight, because of what she had done, they would get that chance. "How bad is the aircraft?" Kim asked. Mitchell shook her head. "The engineers are looking at it now, but initial assessment is that it's a total loss. That missile destroyed the entire left hydraulic system, took out the engine, and damaged the airframe in a dozen places. The fact that you kept it in the air at all is a miracle. The fact that you landed it safely is something that will be studied for years." Over the next few hours, Kim was poked and prodded by doctors, debriefed by intelligence officers, and interviewed by several different commanders who all wanted to know exactly how she had managed to fly and land a dead aircraft. She told the story over and over, each time still not quite believing it herself. By the time they let her go, the sun was rising over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Kim walked slowly back to her quarters, exhausted beyond words. But when she got there, she found she couldn't sleep. Her mind was still racing, replaying every moment of the mission. She thought about the choices she had made. Staying after John left, remaining in the aircraft after the missile hit, attempting the landing instead of ejecting. Any one of those decisions could have killed her. But they had also saved lives. Was that a fair trade? She didn't know. There was a knock on her door. When she opened it, she found John standing there with 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you might need this," he said. They sat together outside her quarters, watching the sun climb higher into the sky. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then John said quietly, "You know they're going to give you a medal for this." Kim shrugged. "I don't need a medal. I just need to know those guys made it home safe." "They did. I talked to one of the SEAL team leaders earlier. He asked me to thank you personally. Said you're the reason his men are alive." Kim felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had cried enough for one day. "We were just doing our job." "No," John said firmly. "What you did went way beyond the job. You had every reason to eject after that missile hit. Protocol said to eject. Training said to eject. But you stayed. Why?" Kim was quiet for a moment, thinking about the question. "Because I remembered why I wanted to be a pilot in the first place. It wasn't about flying fast jets or being the best. It was about protecting people, making a difference, and those SEALs needed me. How could I leave them?" John nodded slowly. "That's what makes you special, Kim. A lot of pilots are skilled, but not many would have made the choices you made tonight." The days that followed were a blur of activity. The story of Kim's mission spread quickly through the military community. Other pilots came by to ask her questions about the manual reversion landing, wanting to know exactly how she had done it so they could incorporate it into their own training. Engineers examined her damaged aircraft, taking measurements and photographs, trying to understand how it had stayed airborne. The SEAL teams that she had supported sent her a plaque with all 381 names engraved on it, along with a simple message: "Guardian Angel, thank you for bringing us home." Kim hung it on the wall of her quarters, and every time she looked at it, she felt a swell of pride. But there were also difficult moments. She had nightmares about the mission, dreams where the missile hit and the aircraft exploded, or where she ejected and was captured by Taliban fighters. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, and have to remind herself that she had made it home safely. The Air Force psychologist assigned to talk with her explained that what she was experiencing was normal. Combat stress affected everyone differently, and her brain was processing the trauma of what she had been through. Kim attended the counseling sessions dutifully, talking through her experiences, learning techniques to manage the anxiety and the nightmares. 3 weeks after the mission, Kim was called to Commander Mitchell's office. When she arrived, she found the room full of people. Commanders, fellow pilots, and a general she didn't recognize who wore more ribbons on his chest than she could count. "Captain Campbell," Mitchell said formally. "Please stand at attention." Kim snapped to attention, her heart racing. She had been through enough military ceremonies to know what was coming, but it still felt surreal. The general stepped forward and began to read from a document. "For extraordinary heroism in aerial combat against an armed enemy force, Captain Kim Campbell distinguished herself by heroism while engaged in combat operations in support of Operation Enduring Freedom." The citation went on to detail the mission, describing how she had provided close air support for multiple SEAL teams under heavy fire, how she had protected a downed helicopter crew, and how she had continued to fight even after her aircraft was severely damaged. It described her decision to remain airborne and her successful landing of a hydraulically dead aircraft. Captain Campbell's actions directly resulted in the preservation of 381 American lives and dealt a significant blow to enemy forces. Her courage under fire and exceptional piloting skills reflect great credit upon herself, the United States Air Force, and the Department of Defense. The general pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to Kim's uniform, and the room erupted in applause. Kim stood there, feeling the weight of the medal, thinking about what it represented. It wasn't just about her. It was about every pilot who had ever flown into danger to protect troops on the ground. It was about the crew chiefs who maintained the aircraft, the controllers who guided them to targets, the medics who patched them up when they got hurt. After the ceremony, pilots lined up to shake her hand and congratulate her. But the moment that meant the most came when a young female lieutenant approached her nervously. "Captain Campbell," the lieutenant said, "I just wanted to say thank you. I'm in pilot training and there aren't many women in the program. Sometimes it feels like I don't belong. But seeing what you did, knowing that you earned that medal through skill and courage, it reminds me why I'm here. You're an inspiration." Kim looked at this young woman and saw herself years ago standing in that line at the Air Force Academy, determined to prove she belonged. She put a hand on the lieutenant's shoulder and smiled. "You do belong here," Kim said. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. And remember, being a good pilot isn't about being a man or a woman. It's about having the courage to do what's right when it matters most." 6 months after that night, Kim Campbell stood in front of a room full of new A-10 pilots at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. She had been asked to speak about her experiences, to teach the next generation of Warthog pilots about combat operations and survival in hostile situations. She had been hesitant at first, uncomfortable with the attention her mission had brought, but she realized that sharing what she had learned could save lives in the future. The manual reversion landing you've all heard about wasn't some moment of genius, Kim told the assembled pilots. It was the result of hundreds of hours of training and years of experience. Every simulator session, every practice flight, every procedure you memorize, it all matters. Because someday, when everything goes wrong, that training is what will save your life and the lives of the people depending on you. She looked around the room at the eager faces, some of them barely out of their teens. They reminded her of herself when she was starting out, full of confidence and excitement, not yet understanding the true weight of what they were signing up for. But here's what I want you to really understand, Kim continued. Flying the A-10 isn't about being a hero, it's about service. It's about being there when the troops on the ground need you most. They're counting on you to keep them safe, to give them a fighting chance when they're outnumbered and outgunned. That's a sacred responsibility. After the class, several pilots approached her with questions. One young captain, fresh from training, asked the question that Kim had been waiting for. Captain Campbell, when that missile hit your aircraft, were you scared? Kim thought about lying, about giving some brave answer about how fear never entered her mind. But these pilots deserved the truth. I was terrified, she said honestly. There was a moment after the missile hit when I thought I was going to die. But fear is just information. It tells you that you're in danger, but it doesn't have to control your actions. I acknowledged the fear and then I focused on what needed to be done. The SEALs on the ground didn't have the luxury of my fear. They needed me to do my job. The young captain nodded thoughtfully. How do you deal with it afterward? The stress, the memories? You talk to people, Kim said. You work with counselors who understand combat stress. You lean on your fellow pilots who have been through similar experiences. And you remember that asking for help isn't weakness. It's smart. Taking care of your mental health is just as important as maintaining your physical fitness. That evening, Kim received an email that made her pause. It was from a sergeant who had been part of one of the SEAL teams she had protected that night. He had tracked down her contact information through military channels because he wanted to tell her something personally. The email was simple, but powerful. The sergeant wrote about being pinned down in that compound, hearing the enemy getting closer, thinking that he might not see his 2 daughters again. He described the moment when he heard the sound of the A-10's cannon, how that sound meant salvation. He told her about returning home to his family, about being there for his daughter's 10th birthday party, about teaching his younger daughter to ride a bike. You gave me the chance to be a father again, the sergeant wrote. You gave 381 of us the chance to go home to the people we love. I know you were just doing your job, but to us you were a miracle. Thank you. Kim read the email 3 times, tears streaming down her face. This was why she had stayed in that aircraft. This was why she had risked everything. Not for medals or recognition, but for this. For fathers who got to see their daughters grow up. For husbands who got to go home to their wives. For sons who got to call their mothers and say they were safe. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. The little girl at the air show, dreaming of flying. The teenager being told to consider other careers. The cadet fighting to prove herself. The pilot learning her craft. And finally, the warrior in the sky, making split-second decisions that would echo through the lives of hundreds of people. The following year, Kim was promoted to major and given command of her own A-10 squadron. It was a position of great responsibility, and she took it seriously. She worked to create a culture where every pilot understood the weight of their duty, where excellence was expected but mistakes were treated as learning opportunities, where asking for help was encouraged rather than seen as weakness. She made sure that her squadron included women pilots, that they were given the same opportunities as their male counterparts, that they were judged solely on their skills and dedication. The barriers that she had faced were starting to come down, but there was still work to be done. She was determined to help clear the path for those who would come after her. Kim also became involved in programs that supported veterans dealing with combat stress. She spoke openly about her own experiences with nightmares and anxiety after the mission, helping to break down the stigma around mental health in the military. She visited wounded warriors in hospitals, sharing her story and offering encouragement to those who were fighting their own battles. On the anniversary of the mission, Kim always took time to reflect. She would look at the plaque with 381 names on her wall and think about each one of those lives. She wondered what they were doing, where they were, whether they remembered that night as vividly as she did. Probably not. For them, it was one mission among many. But for Kim, it would always be the mission that defined her career and her purpose. She received letters occasionally from members of those SEAL teams. Some were short thank you notes. Others were longer, telling her about their lives, their families, their careers. One sent her a photo of his newborn son, born 8 months, after the mission with a note that said, "I named him after a guardian angel." 10 years after that night in Afghanistan, Kim Campbell retired from active duty as a colonel. She had flown hundreds of combat missions, mentored dozens of pilots, and earned the respect of everyone who served with her. But when people asked her about her career, she always came back to that one night, that one mission where everything went wrong and somehow turned out right. At her retirement ceremony, a surprise guest appeared. It was the SEAL team commander who had been leading the operation that night. He was retired now too, his hair gray, his face lined with the experiences of a lifetime in combat. But his handshake was still firm, and his eyes were still sharp. "I've been waiting years to do this in person," he said, pulling Kim into a hug. "You saved my men. You saved me. There are 381 stories that continued because of what you did. Marriages, children, careers, lives fully lived. That's your legacy, Colonel Campbell." Kim looked out at the crowd gathered for her retirement, at the young pilots who were just starting their careers, at the veterans who had served alongside her, at her family who had supported her through everything. She thought about the winding path that had brought her here, from a little girl at an air show to a decorated combat pilot. "I was just doing my job," she said, the same words she had said so many times before. The SEAL commander shook his head. "No. What you did that night went beyond duty. You made a choice to stay when you could have left. You made a choice to fight when you could have run. You made a choice to risk your life so that others could live. That's not just doing a job. That's heroism." As the sun set on her military career, Kim Campbell thought about all the people who had told her she couldn't do it. The counselor who suggested she consider other careers. The cadets who didn't think she belonged. The skeptics who doubted that women could handle combat flying. She had proved them all wrong, not through words, but through actions. But more importantly, she had proved something to herself. She had proved that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing what needed to be done even when you were terrified. She had proved that excellence had no gender. And she had proved that one person, in the right place at the right time, making the right choices, could change the course of 381 lives. The little girl at the air show had achieved her dream. She had touched the sky. She had flown into danger when others needed her most. She had been a guardian angel for warriors on the ground. And she had done it all while showing the world that the only limits that really matter are the ones we place on ourselves. Kim Campbell walked away from her retirement ceremony with her head held high, knowing that somewhere out there, 381 people were living their lives because she had refused to give up. That was a legacy that no medal could ever capture. That was a legacy that would last forever.